Stephen Fry, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the program.
It's a pleasure to be here, Stan, to be all the way reaching from London to Australia. Technology is still wonderful, isn't it?
You've aimed high, haven't you? If you're going to take a story on, just go for Homer.
Yes.
Did you approach this, writing about Troy, did you approach this with some trepidation? You know, the great story had been written.
Well, yes and no, in a way. I think one of the issues with Homer is that anyone who reads a good translation or listens to an audiobook of a good translation of the actual Homer in their own language will agree that the storytelling is supreme. And despite the slew of Greek names and genealogies that go on, it's nonetheless incredibly compelling and doesn't have the reek of what you might call the schoolroom. And I think that was what I was really determined to do, was at least to try and take it out of the arena of classical studies and Latin and Greek and old-fashioned teachers with chalk on their gown telling you how to conjugate the verb luo and so on, which is a whole other world now. I mean, I can't believe it's the world I grew up in, but it's true, I did. And that's probably what gave me my passion for these stories. But I was aware that for some people, they're a bit off-putting. I mean, just the names, Clytemnestra sounds probably more like a sexually transmitted disease than a person. And a lot of these...
Agamemnon sounds as if it's something you have to apologise for.
This Clytemnestra is going to clear up in a week, apparently, so can we hold off till then? Yeah.
What attracted you to it? It is such an eternal story, and there must have been something in contemporary times that you were looking for as well. Was there something that it could tell us about now?
Yes, I think so. I mean, the story that I just adore, which is the kind of one of the propelling moments that causes the war, is a scene that is known in painting and art and literature as the Judgment of Paris. Nothing to do with the city. Paris was a shepherd boy on Mount Ida outside Troy, and he was chosen for various reasons, but we won't go into those now. But he was chosen because of his honesty to be a judge between the three goddesses, Hera, the queen of heaven, known as Juno to the Romans, and Athena, the goddess of wisdom, known as Minerva to the Romans, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, because there was a golden apple that was rolled at a wedding and it had "to the fairest" on it. And suddenly these three gods were in competition as to who was the fairest. It's the old fairy tale question, who is the fairest of them all? Is it Hera, goddess of the queen of heaven and goddess of matrimony and power and respectability, or is it the goddess of wisdom and goddess of beauty? And Paris is offered power and might and riches by Hera if he gives her the apple. And Athena offers him wisdom and insight into the hearts of men and the minds of the gods even, if he gives her the apple. What's a greater prize than wisdom? And Aphrodite says, I've got nothing grand to offer you. All I can offer you is love. And she shows him a little scallop shell and says, open it. And he opens the scallop shell, and there he sees a face that sends flames into his cheeks and his heart to stick in his throat. He's never seen so beautiful a face in his life. His breath goes from his body. Who is that? Who? And Aphrodite says, her name is Helen. And if you give me the apple, I will give you Helen. So, of course, he's a young man. Is he going to give it to the goddess of power? Is he going to give it to the goddess of wisdom? No, he gives it to Aphrodite. So that's a lovely story. It's a fable. But if you think about it, Stan, also, it's saying in human life, we have choices. And it's true about what subject you study at university. You can choose what's going to give you power and riches. You can choose what's going to make you wise and clever, or you can choose what is your passion, what drives you, what is the love, the lust. And that's a choice that all humans face, because we are all riven by, Freud called them the superego, the ego, and the id, but, different appetites and impulses. One is, a greed for power.
Each of them can lead in their own way to disaster.
Different kinds of disaster.
And we see in this, of course, this is love. This is a love story, but it's also a story of war. It's a story that's still taught in war military colleges today. The generals of tomorrow are learning about this today.
They are, and its depiction of war is second to none. I mean, the brutality I had thought when I was retelling that the bits I would least like to have to retell are the battle scenes that Homer paints during his depiction of the final year of the final month, really, of the war. And but I found that actually there was something strangely moving about it. There's so much sort of sacrifice, and he always gives, even in the smallest snapshot, a kind of identity to someone. You know, I mean, it's physically, their spears go into helmets and brains burst out of the helmets and blood shoots out of the sockets of the helmets. It's pretty, you know, X-rated, the violence of it, but it somehow makes the, you know, the pity of war, as Wilfred Owen put it, all the more apparent. And of course, the other thing is that this took place in what we, you know, archaeologists call now the Bronze Age, before humankind had learnt to smelt iron. It was copper and tin made bronze, which was hard and made for good weapons. And this was it was a pre-literate age as well. And yet, what's sort of interesting is the war seems to show humanity jostling for what quality is most important in solving a problem. And there are the great warriors, Achilles and Ajax and Hector, whose swords and whose speed and whose athleticism and power and courage seem to be about to win the war, but they're not enough. It takes the craft, the wiliness, the subtlety of Odysseus to dream up the famous Trojan horse. And so what wins the war is not great warriorship, not great strategy or in terms of military deployment of, you know, phalanxes of troops, but it's a cunning and deceitful ploy. And so it's as if mankind is just stretching the muscles that make us the species, because after, you know, 1,000 or so years, 2,000 years after the Trojan War, that's when Greece arose into its great form of the power of Athenian, you know, democracy, logic, music, justice. All these elements were suddenly important.
It's become fashionable, in fact, to look back to ancient Greece as a way of explaining where we're at. There's a lot of discussion around the Thucydides trap and the Peloponnesian War and the War of Athens and Sparta, rising power, waning power, and again looking at, say, China and the United States. What are your thoughts on where we are at today with what looks like a return of great power rivalry that is reshaping our world?
They seem to revolve around the very reason that made the Greeks so extraordinary was they came, like so many other tribes and peoples and clans and groups from around the Mediterranean. They just came together, but they came together at a time when it seems sea levels were becoming stable enough to have ports and harbors that wouldn't flood. So you could start to get lines of trade. And they traded with the Phoenicians, who gave them the alphabet. And they became a kind of what we would call a Western democracy. I mean, give or take a lot. There was slavery, there was all kinds of things we would have found totally unacceptable. But within, you know, considering what a new idea it was, and they had drama and art and music. Pythagoras divined these wonderful music rules of harmony, and they were aware that they were unique, and they weren't sure why, but they realized. And this is when Nietzsche gave a brilliant description of them. They realized that they were compounded of two impulses, especially. One was represented by their god Apollo. It was reason and order and harmony and logic and music and oration, you know, rhetoric, and all things to do with reason, mathematics as well. And then there was another god, Dionysus, who was a god of impulse and frenzy and addiction and passion. And their plays, this is how Nietzsche put it in his book, The Birth of Tragedy, their plays were, their dramas were a playing out of these two opposing impulses. And then in history, it happened to them, because the Spartans across the Gulf in Peloponnesian, in the Peloponnese, they were much more militaristic, much less interested in art and drama and poetry and music. They were interested in conquest. They were like Klingons in Star Trek, if you like. They were, you know, famous for that. Well, we use the word Spartan of conditions that are absolutely, you know, brutal. And they went to war with Athens, which was coming, you know, you might say, with freedom of speech to some extent, with philosophy and art and music and open discussion and open voting and a jury system for your law, comes weakness. Some people believe that. And we look at, Putin and China, they think the West is soft because of our institutions that we think guarantee freedom and openness and exchange and development and progress. Those very things that we most cling to as an advantage can be seen as a weakness. And the Trojan War plays that out too, I think.
Stephen, are we also contributing to that when we look at what is a decay, or what is seen as a decay in Western society, challenging, things? I know you've spoken a lot about this, but the ideas of identity and what we can say and what we can't say, and what we can write and what we can't write, and what we can think and what we can't think, and the policing of these things, and of course how this gives rise to a political tribalism. And you've seen elements of that in the UK with Brexit, with Trump in the US, the rise of a far right across Europe. But I know you've been concerned about what you see as this identity that may erode our own societies.
I think that's right. I think there is an impulse for people to retreat into very fixed identities and to identify as this or as that. And I can understand a lot of it. We all can. We all know how brutally people from various minorities have been treated, and how much they, all of us, feel the need sometimes to band together and to have movements and show pride in this. But there is a danger. There is a danger when it stops us from thinking freely about ourselves and allowing ourselves to leak from one identity to another, to be ambiguous, to be more than ambiguous, which is just two-sided, but to be polybiguous.
To have contradiction.
And clearly there isn't. Yes, I am exactly like Walt Whitman. We are masses of contradiction. We contain universe. We are multifarious. And we shouldn't be afraid or embarrassed by that. We should say, I used to think this. In fact, only yesterday I thought this, but today I don't. Or I wonder. Or I doubt myself.
But that requires us to stop and think. It also requires us to be honest. And what we're seeing so much now is identity and politics feeding into even the notion of truth. We can invent our own facts and our own truths.
Which is, of course, horrific. And a lot of it is a lack of confidence, a lack of education, and a lack of real self-respect. That if you are fortunate enough to have the confidence in your own doubt, then your own human makeup is armor enough against anything. You don't need to put on the armor of an identity, whereas those find it much easier to put on the armor of this kind of feminist, this kind of trans activist, this kind of gay person, this kind of white, angry, that's their armor. And it protects their real self underneath, which is a mixture of all kinds of things. He's actually a bit sympathetic towards this, understands that may be going too far, wonders if this is truly the answer. All these weak, bleating, liberal things that seem to be a weakness are strength of a free mind, ranging over issues and allowing itself to change and allowing itself to feel differently about things, and realizing, that there are contradictory impulses that we have. On the one hand, we want to stand alone and be an individual. I am who I am. I want to stand apart from the tribe, the muddy tribe. I'm myself, glorious me. I am me. Another part longs to be accepted into a group and to belong to a group. And that's a tension. But it's, I think, a tension that's creative and exciting and part of the nature of being human, that we are in a space between individualism and group. To be only one, it seems to me not how humans are.
And of course, so much of this is feeding into issues like climate change, where they stop being issues of science and become issues of ideology, politics, or identity. Do you see us coming out of this? Are we in a process of emerging from this, or is this type of polarization and ideology and rejection of truth or rejection of science really seeping into our societies?
It seems to be more than ever, but I think that's partly because there are more more vents to release that steam, as it were, than there ever were. So we know more about it. In the past, people might have doubts about this, that, and the other, but they couldn't disseminate them. They couldn't sort of broadcast them. They couldn't poison the wells of discourse quite as much as now people can. And no matter how much YouTube may tamp down this account, and Facebook will ban them, and Twitter will put a warning sticker on those people. Nonetheless, there's always ways out for these anti-scientific and sometimes malevolent things, sometimes just muddle-headed. But generally speaking, I'm a little bit optimistic. I do think it's, whether it's 3 steps forward and 2 back, or 2 steps forward and 1 back, I do think we inch towards an improvement in general understanding.
That leads to the final thing I wanted to talk to you about, and that was COVID. Of course, we have seen great kindness and great empathy, but we've also seen a rejection of the threats of COVID, and the rejection of science that has cost lives. How has that changed us? What is the post-COVID world going to look like?
It's a really good point. I've given up being able to claim even any sort of prophetic gift. The last few years have made fools of any prophet that I've come across.
And opinion polls.
Yeah. I mean, I do think one of the sciences that is most interesting, partly because it's a little bit nebulous, but it is a driver of so much policy in all countries of the world. I've sort of looked into this, and all the scientific cabals and groups and advisory bodies that governments have. I'm sure there's plenty in Australia at a state level and a federal level, and same in Britain and America. There are these. And people talk about immunologists and virologists and epidemiologists, but they ignore the fourth science, which is behavioral science. It's how people as a group behave and how they behave as individuals. It's a strange fact of humanity that's been known about for a long time, which is that you can predict to an astonishing degree of accuracy how a group of people, an average group of people, will behave under certain circumstances. But you can never predict what an individual is going to do. So it's a strange science that's a little connected to game theory and higher forms of statistics and psychology and old-fashioned, behavioral science, some of which in the 50s and 60s became quite unfashionable. It became, as we moved towards a genetic explanation of human behavior rather than a conditioned one. But the fact is, there are lots of scientists sitting down and advising government, and the government's obeying advice, not really on the basis exactly of science as we're thinking it, medical science, but on the basis of, no, if you do that week, it'll mean there'll be 2.5 weeks of this, which is just too much for most people to bear. They're more likely to be riots and demonstrations. If you phase it out this way, people, and nudge them. So the science of the nudge, and a lot of it is, as I say, it's kind of dark arts, but it is vital. And it's a bit like actuarial tables. It's just a prediction of how people behave.
Yes.
That is not based on any moral sense of whether people are good or bad. It's just people will, what we don't want, to use an Australian scenario, which we've all been frightened of, is a kind of Mad Max world to develop, where there are really genuinely frightening figures there, brutal people who will just go for the jugular and go for greed and so on.
It brings us back.
A very long way of saying I don't know what's going to happen.
It does bring us back it does bring us back to Troy, doesn't it? We still face the choice of Paris, don't we? Is it riches, wisdom, or love that we give the apple to?
Yes, and just a thing that shocked me when I was, sort of looking at it again, is I'd forgotten that at the very beginning of Homer's Iliad, the thing that propels the entire story of the Iliad is a plague, is infection that runs through the Greek camp. There's disease, and amazingly, and Homer must have known that this was a viable and truthful observation. The plague starts with the animals. The animals get sick and they pass it on to the humans. And we now know, of course, that it's very likely coronavirus might have started with animals, and we know that smallpox and all kinds of diseases that have destroyed humanity over the centuries have transmitted from animals to humans. So Troy even has that truth buried inside it.
Stephen, it's been a delight. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your day and to share that time with us.
Thanks for giving me so much time, and all the very best. Lots of love.
Thank you.
Go Australia. Bye-bye.
Hi, I'm Lee Sales. Thanks for watching this story. If you'd like to watch more of 7:30's stories, they are on the left of your screen. And tap on the button below to subscribe and get the latest from ABC News.